So nice to see you back, and so nice to see some new people to these sessions. We've had an amazing day today so far. Just a reminder that today's discussions are all about the world after Ukraine. I mean, there's no after Ukraine. Ukraine's still happening, but we're trying to see what impact the war in Ukraine is having in so many areas of the world. And today we've discussed the superpowers, the changing dynamics of the superpowers. We've discussed specifically Europe, how this is affecting Europe, how Europe is responding to the Ukrainian crisis. We've gone a deeper dive specifically into your country. For many of you are Czech, I'm sure, into the Czech Republic, who has just become the president of the EU. How should Czech respond to what's happening in Ukraine? How is it responding? And we just had a fascinating conversation about Africa, about what's happening in Africa and how Ukraine is affecting what's happening in Africa. Now we're going to try and pull some of this together. I've got three of today's experts. We've got Matt Steinglass here, who is the Europe editor of The Economist magazine.
Deputy editor.
Europe correspondent. The Europe correspondent, sorry. I've done a lot of talking today. If I get a few things wrong, you forgive me. It's like I'm like, So, the Europe correspondent of The Economist magazine. So a lot of the stuff written about Europe in The Economist magazine. Who here reads The Economist magazine? Put your hands up. Anyone read The Economist magazine? No, you haven't got. You haven't got any fans here, Matt. You should. It's a great magazine. We've got Martin Schmeidel, who is the editor of Africa Today and based in. Sorry. Modern Africa, I've got it written in front of me. And which university again?
University of Hradec Králové.
Yeah, that one. And Jakub Zantu, who I'm sure many of you know, is on your television screens reporting from all over the world as a foreign correspondent. So we're going to try and pull this together. I want to start with the conversation we were just having. And by the way, for those of you who haven't been in a session, this is a conversation with all of us. So if you've got something you want to say, a question you want to ask, or a point you want to make, stick your hand up and I'll try and spot you, and I want to bring you in through the conversation. So this isn't just us talking. But I want to start with the area we just discussed. How much of what we believe is happening in Ukraine, or believe people think about what's happening in Ukraine, is seen from a European point of view? We've heard a lot today that outside of our bubble, large parts of the world see this whole conflict very differently. Jakub, as a man who reports from Ukraine, just come back from Ukraine, what's your view of that?
Well, we are living in a world that we thought is post-Cold War, when in fact the Northern Hemisphere was dictating the whole world what's going on, how to perceive it, how to understand that. And I don't think we're beyond that. So in fact, everybody understands, let's say in the Southern Hemisphere, in the former so-called Third World, that it is important for them. No matter what happens, they will be somehow related to the conflict going on. The question is whether it's so central as we think it is, as we understand it in Europe, and it certainly is not. It is understood, as far as I understand, in both Southern America, Africa, Middle East, and Asia, as a big contest between the West, the America-dominated West, and Russia. And they are opportunistically, in some cases, they're just waiting for the outcome, because Russia has done a lot of work in spreading, in regaining the influence it used to have as a Soviet Union in the last 30 years. Africa, I think, is right. I don't want to go into your expertise too much, certainly, but that is the case, as is China. And then everybody is actually waiting for the outcome of the war, and I guess many are opportunistically waiting for both the sides to actually lose strength.
To do in order for what to happen?
In order for the void to be filled by them. I mean, that is China, obviously, but it's not just China. And economy-wise, it certainly are the BRIC countries. Brazil is waiting. India is conspicuously silent, and it's being pushed by the West to be more sort of active, but it doesn't want to, obviously. So I think, it really is understood as a contest in the Northern Hemisphere between the traditional two blocks, and then everybody's waiting when it's gonna be, when it ends, and then we'll see who our bigger friend will be. But obviously they don't want to be pushed to take sides because they don't understand that as their work, because it's not.
Fascinating. Now, okay, so Martin, same question. From an African point of view, we just discussed some of these issues. Let's go into that.
Obviously, we always see it as from our European point of view because we live in some context. But we have to agree, and we have to probably, it's true that it is not only European conflict or conflict in Europe. It is somehow a challenge to the whole world order. It's a global conflict because somehow, obviously, Russia is also fighting, for example, information war in Africa. Sputnik News, we have been talking about it now. Sputnik News is very active in African countries, somehow presenting the narrative, Russian narrative about the conflict that, well, we have been endangered. I've mentioned earlier that for some presidents of African states actually using the same narrative. So, well, it is important to know what are the visions, from different parts of the world, because then we can somehow well say, okay, maybe this is coming. We can think about what different countries will do, because obviously the countries, as was mentioned, countries have their own, let's say, national interests still. So they somehow have to be, well, should I side with Russia? Should I side with the West? Or the narrative is here. The pro-Western countries against Russia again. India has this strange position in that, and many of the African countries too. Because, South Africa could have a lot of money out of this conflict because of the selling of the coal to European states. But also, it's buying arms from Russia. So what should you do? Which side you will take? And so many of the countries are on this very edgy position, I would say, and trying to be a bit, I'd say, like fuzzy positioning in the end. So it is not clear who they're siding because simply they do not want to show the cards that they are holding in hands. And that's make very uncertain, actually. I would say that right now, the world, the situation is very, very uncertain in this point of view.
In fact, in this conversation we had just now about Africa, you made the point that 17 African nations abstained in a recent United Nations vote on this, many of whom, of course, are client states in one way or another of Russia, and in other cases.
It have been actually more. 17 have been abstaining during the voting, but several others didn't even, let's say, appear in the voting. They simply did not participate. 17 abstained, 1 have been against, and I think it was altogether the states which have been against or abstained in some point of way. I think it was 20, 24 maybe.
That's fascinating. I mean, we think that it's all clear, the right and the wrong in this, but clearly outside of our bubble, it doesn't look that way. Matt, now obviously you cover Europe, but you've covered the world for The Economist, and what's your view on this situation?
I just wanted to add 2 points. One is I think what you're seeing partly is the consequences of Western inconsistency and hypocrisy in our approach towards different conflicts, and the fact that we are so enthusiastically supportive of Ukraine in its conflict with Russia and allowed Syria to burn, didn't care as much about civilian casualties in Iraq. All of those things have long-term repercussions, and now we're seeing the effects. We've lost a lot of our credibility. Actually, 2 other things to note. One is, if you're looking for a population of people from the global south who are sympathetic with the Ukrainian position, you will find that among Syrian refugees in Europe, because they left fleeing the same things, Russian bombs. The destruction of Aleppo is it's the model for the destruction of Kharkiv. So part of our inability to explain to the global south what's happening here is our failure to have taken it on in Syria. And the other thing is that we haven't done, the Ukrainians have been superb at winning the propaganda war in the West against Russia. They have not won the propaganda war to present themselves as victims of colonialism and imperialism. And I think a lot of Ukrainians are, I mean, I don't know how many Ukrainians are in the room right now, but I think a lot of Ukrainians are very upset about that, particularly when the Western left attacks the United States position and characterizes the war in Ukraine as a Russian effort to struggle against the imperialistic West. I think Ukrainians are outraged that people don't see them as a country that has historically been a victim of imperialism.
That's very interesting. This anti-West view. By the way, to share, in the preparation for this day, I had an interview with an American academic who specializes in Southeast Asia. And he said to me that in large parts of Southeast Asia, places like Indonesia, Malaysia, again, it's a very strong anti-American view of the world. And so therefore, they're actually supporting the Russian perspective that this is actually the Americans it's another example, the Americans pushing closer to them, forcing them into having to respond. And so it feels like there's large parts of the world where the West is in a weaker position as a result of this, even though the conflict itself may or may not be going well. If you look forward, Jakub, with your perspective, if we take this as a West versus the rest view, it's not as simple as that. Do you think the West might be weaker around the world as a result of what's happened?
It will certainly be weaker because now it's clearly showing that the West is not able to push Russia and Ukraine during the war to get the food that is needed from the front line. Well, Ukraine feeds 400 million people in the world, and most of those people being in the parts of the world we're talking about that are not that are not part to this conflict. So now it seems that, well, there has been so much talk in the last, let's say, 10, 20 years of America receding, America withdrawing from Africa, withdrawing from the Middle East, withdrawing from, let's say, not Asia, because, well, that's been Obama's goal, which is still apparently on the agenda, but from other parts of the world. And this void is being filled by others. China very much involved, and Russia in the second place as well. That is both South Asia, Southeast Asia. That is Africa. That is South America. So this perception of the former imperial foe, the Americans being able to sort of in the last 30 years to push their interests and the bubble together with the West everywhere in the world on this, let's say, post-colonial, post-imperialist understanding of how power is radiated all around the world. Then many of the politicians who are in this part of the world supposedly pro-Western, when the cameras are not on, they're pretty happy that America and the West are getting the bashing. And certainly this post-colonial thing and this, let's say, distrust of the West that is, as you rightly mentioned, that is not just we are so active in that conflict, but we don't care about the other one, and we don't certainly care about the other one, is that a country like South Africa or a country like Brazil, they say, okay, now so you perceive yourself and you show yourself as the just ones in the world. Now we can clearly see the hypocrisy. So even if, for me, I don't care about conflict in Ukraine, but it's not in my interest that Russia actually does something that elevates the prices of everything, still you're a little happy that America is again withdrawing and that the West will, and I think it will, come out of the conflict, whatever the end of the conflict will be, it will be weaker.
Yeah, and I'm particularly, by the way, in the last session you mentioned, Martin, we were talking about the Wagner Group in Africa, which of course is very active in Ukraine. And you mentioned, in passing, only a few weeks ago, the Wagner Group massacred 300 people in Africa, is that right?
It was, I think, in March in Mali, one of the biggest civilian massacre in recent years.
Who heard about, in March this year, 300 Malian people being massacred by the Wagner Group? Put your hands up. So, I hadn't, by the way, so there are 3 people over there. So, This is the evidence, isn't it? If they massacred 300 people in Kiev tomorrow, we'd hear all about it, right? But we didn't hear about it in Mali.
I was actually thinking about its hypocrisy, and that will probably a word that we will repeat a lot. Because that's the thing, it's like we want African states, for example, to support us in fight against Russia. And I don't know, me being African president, or whatever, I would be like, where have you been during Rwanda? Where have you been when Paul Kagame simply raiding other countries around? Paul Kagame, Rwandan president, he was very, how to say it, yeah. He was once he was favorite of the West, very favorable president, because he was successful in development. So we simply didn't take a look on how non-democratic he is. We simply closed our eyes when opposition leader died, surprisingly. And this is the way of hypocrisy. Why we should care about what's happening in Europe, and why we should side with you when you simply didn't care also, you know?
The only thing is that I would push back against my own argument to some extent. The advantage that Russia has is that it has no compunction about backing autocrats. There's no ideological component to Russian support, and there are no scruples. There's no expectation that they won't commit war crimes. They specialize in war crimes, and they win wars by committing war crimes deliberately. The West is in a more difficult position because we can't do things like that. And if we did more things like, I mean, our position with respect to people like Paul Kagame, I think Western support for Kagame is the closest we get to doing what the Russians do. And I don't know how long lasting how long Africans will be happy about receiving support from.
Now, it's interesting to me. We've talked a lot today about Russia, for understandable reasons. We talked a lot today about the EU, which we will come to again in this discussion, I'm sure. We talked a bit, but I really want to go into this now, China. So one of the really interesting questions is whether China emerges from this stronger or weaker. I had a conversation with a guy who wasn't here today, but was going to be here, called Bobo Lo, who's written a lot of books on China-Russia relations. His view was, actually, Ukraine is exposing China's weakness, that China is looking on scared of Ukraine for two reasons. One, because he said that China is the closest thing that Russia has to a friend. And just before Ukraine, as we know, we think even Putin got permission from China, potentially there's talk of, to go into Ukraine. But the response to Putin, the way Putin is seen in the West now, China does not want to be seen in that way. And of course, China still depends a lot on West so he thinks China is actually in trouble. But there are so many counter arguments to that, and I'd like to just get into those. So let's start with you, Matt, if I may. Just draw for me some lines you think of where China, what's happened affects China's position in the world.
China has changed a lot in the last 10 years. And if you looked at their diplomatic habits 10 years ago, I would have completely agreed. I mean, Bobolo is an expert on China, I'm not. But that argument would have been completely persuasive 10 years ago. The Chinese position was stable and relatively predictable. Their diplomacy was modest, and they didn't like unnecessary complications, which could screw things up economically. And that has changed enormously in the last 5 years. They have this extremely aggressive new diplomacy, this wolf warrior sort of attitude. They seem to enjoy pissing off Sweden and castigating the West for its moral pretensions. They kick up unnecessary dust-ups, and I don't know how that doesn't quite jibe with my sense of where China stands at the moment. But I mean, also I think we are at risk of being overly self-confident about the degree to which China is still dependent on us economically in the West. The changes in China in the last 15 years since I first went there are so enormous. It's just a huge economy.
Okay. Martin, do you want to put it close to your mouth as well?
Okay. I just wonder, it's always hard for political... I never like to predict something, especially about China. I still remember when a lot of political scientists would say, I don't know, several years ago, well, with the economic development in China, democracy will come. That was very popular. Well, apparently we are here and nothing changed. And so I would agree what Matt actually mentioned, that China have been for a very long time very nicely predictable. And now they are in a position, and that's now me a bit speculating what could happen or not. I would somehow expect that China is that opportunistically or in that opportunistic position and waiting what will come out of the conflict, because China could actually in the end come, I would say, stronger, because it could fill the gaps because Europe will probably focus on different parts of the world in case they will not see, for example, Africa as an opportunity. And honestly, I'm not sure whether whether the European Union or European states will do it. And then China is again here. Well, okay, we are here. We will fill this gap. We will give you what you need. We will trade with you, and they will just do their own conflicts, but we will care. Now it's like very paraphrasing, and from some point of view, China could be also somehow, inactive in this point of sense. Like, I think that from one point of view, China would be happy if there would be, let's say, peaceful situation, and it's still in this way same happy when Europe has some conflict or war with Russia, and therefore it can then have the opportunity to fill those gaps that European states or United States have to somehow leave because of the conflict.
Okay, Jacob, surely in at least one respect China wins, because America was desperate to pivot to China, and frankly, Europe, not really get too involved in Europe. Ukraine has dragged America back to have to deal with Europe, spend tens of billions of dollars on this problem in Europe, and surely, in that respect, at least, China is gains from that, isn't it? What's your view of this?
There's a nice Czech saying, when two are having a fight, the third one is laughing, right? That's what's happening right now in Beijing. On the other hand, Beijing is losing Ukraine, and they have invested hundreds of millions of dollars. They were buying not just food from China, they even rented huge swath of land that Chinese companies were doing agricultural business on, huge ones. And they were buying Ukrainian missile bases that they used, to make their own rockets. Again, big deals. They invested in railway infrastructure, which is very obsolete from the Soviet times, etc. So they're losing direct investment right now. Obviously, they're very much looking forward to the West's reaction with the idea of possibly taking Taiwan, which has been on the agenda for very much time, and talking about their switch, very aggressive diplomacy. It's been a couple of weeks since Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi set off on this very quick tour on 8 pretty small, but very small in means of interest. But let's say when it comes to the huge swaths of Pacific, very important possible allies, Solomon Islands, Fiji, etc., that have been maybe not very active on the agenda of the United States, and Australia. That's why Australia now is ringing the bells and now starting to do that. How in Washington, when you really have your sights on what's going on in Ukraine and pumping billions of dollars because you know that Europe is not strong enough, how are you pumping the same amount of money into African infrastructural programs, etc.? You just don't do that. So there has been a lot of talk that China is now trying to now understands the civilizational leap from a land-based to a maritime-based empire that they used to have, the same as Britain used to be, and then America took over. That's why I think the Pacific Island tour actually took place. And second thing, they're using pretty much the same tactic as buying off pieces of land and infrastructure, etc., as they did in Africa and in South America. They're doing in Siberia. They're buying off the east of Russia. there is a number that I was astonished by, that there is at least 2 million Chinese workers long-term working in China-based Chinese-owned companies in Siberia. They're buying off the wood, they're buying off gold, coal, anything they can do. The same thing that they did in Ethiopia and in Eastern Africa, they're doing there. And now I'm thinking, last time I was filming in Ethiopia, in Gondar region, which is really far from Addis Ababa, there was a small guy who came to me, clearly a snowflake, a Muzungu, and they asked me whether I was Chinese, because Chinese were the cool guys that came from somewhere else than Ethiopia. They're building the roads and railroads, and the only sign that there is something called Europe was a rusty sign that said, childhood is a time for play, not for parenthood. That's what we are doing, right? So we leave these things all around Ethiopia while Chinese are actually building the infrastructure. When you go back to Addis Ababa, you want to leave, there's a huge statue in front of the airport, the style that we used to have all around, of socialist, crude, huge, concrete, two guys kissing. It's not LGBT pride, no. I would love to see that in Ethiopia. No, it's a Chinese and Ethiopian worker building the bright future, right? So that thing is now maybe happening also in Siberia. So if somebody will be weaker from this conflict, and West, I'm sure will be with America, Russia will be as well. And China, opportunistically, just like Martin said, is waiting for all the opportunities because they're just waiting for the gaps. And the gaps there will be very wide.
I mean, I want to come to the audience, but one of the other things Bobo Lo said to me, which I thought was, your Siberia story is amazing, 2 million Chinese in Siberia. He said that, of course, what we've got to realize is that Russia is, after this, is really becoming dependent on China because it's going to sell it more of its gas and so on, particularly if Germany stops buying. And Russia, in some ways, could become a client state of China. That China's the power there, and Russia, which is a superpower still, but in terms of its economy and its needs, so China becomes even stronger, and that you've just proven it with what you just said. That's amazing. I'm keen to come to the audience and get any questions or thoughts. Yeah. Here he is again. He's my favourite. He asks a question every time. I love it. I'm you normally in the audience, so I know. But before you do,
my first question is, can I open your bottle of water for you?
do you know? I'd love you to. I can't because I'm sure I'm going to spray it everywhere. I'm certain I'm going to spray it everywhere. Yeah, that would be great. I'm going to get the mic here, but I'm also keen, particularly, to hear from women in the audience because we're 4 guys, and I don't want us to only have guys talking to guys. So, if women, I want you to please think of a question, and if you feel more comfortable speaking in Czech than in English, please do so. We can work it out up here. 2 of us speak fluent Czech and can tell the other 2 what you said. So feel free to do so. But if you open my water, thank you. Where's the mic? Have we got the microphone over here, please? Thank you. And anyone else want to put their hands up that want to say something? Got 2 bearded guys. Have we got any other women who want to speak? No? Okay.
There's a bearded woman somewhere in the back, I think.
We're not against beards. We're not beardist here, but okay.
But there are bearded women out there.
Quick questions, quick answers.
Well, it's actually, everything I've heard for the last few days on this stage has been leading me to one big overarching question. The world after Ukraine, are we in the early stages of a grand decoupling of globalism? China is not going to need American consumers for very much longer. I just see this pieces of the puzzle moving. So where China has its own giant domestic market to feed. Matt, you mentioned, their goals are changing. So is this the beginning of the disintegration of globalization, and it's going to be U.S., Europe, South America, and China with the rest of the world?
I think it was I think it was Lubomir, the former Czech foreign minister, who said he doesn't want it to be like 1984 with Oceania, Eurasia. Can you give the mic to this lady here, please? Thank you. It's question number 2. So, end of deglobalization, question 1. Question 2.
Hi, I'm concerned about energies because, I just been to the meeting with some Western European TSOs for gas, and they were like, how did this happen? Like, we never were concerned about security of supplies, and now we are. And it feels like for Czech Republic this was a topic all time long since we broke from communism. And I was wondering how this new world order after Ukraine, how this weaker Western will be affected by this, because it's not only Russia who is not really friendly and who can provide energies, gas, coal, and this stuff. It's also states in Africa, also, well, USA, let's say, they can provide some, but also states from Asia and so on and so on. And it feels like it's a very unfriendly environment for Europe. So how this will translate to our next situation? Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Martin, I'm going to come to you on that one. And then there's another bearded guy over there. Well, no, I said to this guy, over there. Thank you. Yeah. And then we'll come to you later. We'll answer these first. So yeah, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question on the influence. You said the Chinese are building infrastructure. They're investing in Africa, spending money in Africa and stuff. It's just something that I don't perceive as a Western kind of influence. I think the Western kind of influence is the cultural influence that the West inspired, you know, the people in Soviet Union, the people in Eastern Europe, by the lifestyle, by the freedom that we enjoyed in the West, and that's what they wanted. So, is it necessarily something bad that we just leave it to China to build the infrastructure and just take over then with the cultural influence?
Thank you. I really understand that question. So let's start with, is globalization decoupling? Matt, can I ask you, let's start with you, from The Economist, your view on globalization. Where's it going?
Yeah, we've been writing about deglobalization for a couple of years. We had some very clever cover on it, and I can't remember what our pun was. But yeah, it's definitely moving in the opposite direction. The geostrategic interests have become much more important. The fact that Germany has finally had to wake up to the risk of coupling its economy to cheap energy and its energy entirely to Russia is, is a glaring example of that. I was a little bit interested also in the second questioner's note about TSOs wondering, suddenly being shocked to find that their gas supplies are not secure. I have no idea why a major company would not have been worried about that for the last 10 years. And those warnings have been passed down to the Germans for decades, and they haven't been listening.
Yeah,
but I would say China's economy is, in the same way that Germany's economy was unwisely predicated on exports to the Chinese market. China's economy is still unwisely predicated on exports to the outside world. Their consumer demand is not high enough. They have a hugely over-leveraged property market, which is in the throes of the beginning of a collapse, and all is not tremendously rosy with their economy either. But yes, it is decoupling.
While we've got you, and we'll come to those in a minute, the final question was that, actually, even if we're not doing infrastructure, we win on ideas, on culture. Everyone really wants to be Western, just like the Eastern Europeans wanted to be. So we should be, what do you think about that?
Then, I have to apologize to you as a Briton, but we end up like Britain.
That's a good thing.
Economically, past our prime. Our influence is lower, and we retain. We still have all the hit rock groups.
But we still have the Queen. We have the Queen. But but seriously, joking aside, is it because one of the things Bobo Lowe talked to me about? Again, I keep quoting him because he's an interesting guy. He said he came up with the phrase of de-universalization. Right? What that means is, he says it's the end of a view that we all ultimately want to be liberal democracies with we want Coca-Cola, we want McDonald's, that this is no longer simply the view. What do you think?
I'm going to try and keep this as short as I can. So there's a couple things to say. One is, no country has made it from middle income to high income without embracing the rule of law. The rule of law, to date, is a Western invention. You look down the roster of countries that have gone to high income. I mean, middle income is great. Making 20,000 euros a year is lovely. If you want to get to 40,000 euros a year, if you want to be Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Western Europe, etc., then you need the rule of law and you need democracy. Or you need to be sitting on a lot of oil. And if you can show me the country that has gotten to that kind of, to that level of human enjoyment, represented by those kinds of income levels, that hasn't embraced those Western values, at that point, then you start to really, then that's a real demonstration that universal values
does that mean that ultimately the West wins because our great story wins? You know, liberal democracy wins.
I don't know if we win. I think that it proves the argument is right. It doesn't. The fact that your argument is right doesn't mean you win in the end. But this is one more thing.
Yeah.
Part of the question for us in the West is why do we care about losing influence? I mean, I think that goes to the question about cultural influence and what we represent. It's more about what we represent. It's not so much necessarily investing and making a lot of money. Why do we care about this? And I think we still care because we care about our values. We care about freedom. We care about the rule of law in the sense that we believe that citizens have a right to be defended equally by their governments. They have a right to equal access to the courts. We believe in those kinds of societies. And it's bad that we're not winning, you know? I mean, from our point of view, we only have our point of view. Maybe from a Chinese point of view, that's not bad. But we believe in our values, and it's bad that they're not winning.
Can I come to Jacob first of all, Martin? Just on, let's start with global. Like, you're a guy that just traveled the world, sees this, all a view on globalization.
Well, I would like to say that, and I'm talking as one of the Czechs here, to guys who come from maritime empires, former and a current one. We're newcomers to globalization, right? Martin is apparently way younger than me. I'm always excited when I sit on an airplane, when I cross the border between Czech Republic and Germany, and that there's no border. I don't need to go somewhere, show somebody some document. That for me is an everlasting miracle. Now, I want to say as a newcomer to that, globalization is nothing new, and we have not invented that. Globalization existed way before your ancestors and other in the 1600s started to actually conquer the world, but at the time, let's say, to discover the world. Go to Istanbul's Atatürk airport or to Dubai, and you'll see what globalization looked like with just a small fraction of white faces. There's black Africans traveling to China, Chinese traveling to East Africa, Arabs of all countries traveling around, and you'll be asked to show the passport to an Indian, Bangladeshi, or a Pakistani speaking fluent Arabic with the Arab behind him. That is globalization. So I don't see any end of globalization, and I don't see any new world order being developed now. It's what's happening is maybe some kind of adjustment, and that certainly is. But let us not bury Rome too early, right? When it comes to your question, which I think is very important, there was a book at the beginning of the 90s that was published that made a lot of fuss. And the poor author, Samuel Huntington, got a lot of bashing. I would love him to be alive to see the book and to have a world tour and say, I was right. It was right in many things, and one of them being the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, by the way, which he describes in the book quite in a lot of detail. Now, he talks about culture and cultures and the clash of civilization on the cultural things. And yes, I agree, the power of the Coca-Cola can all around the world, China and Russia included, is very powerful, and it will still be there. Now, Hollywood is being bought off by Chinese companies, and now they're doing all the silly nationalistic adjustments to the movies, and one version for China and the other version for the West, etc., which I think is ridiculous, and it's actually disgusting. When it comes to the fact that they still want to buy the Coke and they want Hollywood to do the silly movie, shows something. We're not losing the cultural war. We still are interesting. Why? Because of what Matt said. The rule of law, the power of individual creativity, the power of individual freedom being defended by the rule of law, because that is the only thing that is pushing us forward somewhere. You can copy many things and then you can mass produce them and cheaper, and you can actually kill the first company that developed that. Yes, and that is happening, yes. But are they creating something that we're like really sitting in awe? Yes, they will eventually, maybe. But is there something that you want to be? Is there anything Chinese that you want to do? Is there a Chinese hat or something? Yes, it may be because globalization and culture. Yes, but it's not that you want to be Chinese. You want really be into Chinese culture or into Russian culture. You take a segment. So I think we'll still. I mean, as the West, as a collective West, there will still be a lot of interest, and I don't think we're losing. And again, let's not bury Rome too soon. It's cool to say that at events like that, and so many people say that, and I see such a big inflation. And by the way, Rome was buried so many times, and it still existed in the Byzantium, etc., for years to come. So we're not. I don't think we're losing much.
Well, again, one of the things though about it, I'll come to the energy thing in a moment. I will come to that question. But one of the things that I've heard talked about is there isn't a single globalization. There are multiple globalizations. There's if you like, Western globalization of Western values, but there's also Chinese globalization in the way you described. The Chinese are global. There's technology globalization. There's if you like, Silicon Valley globalization, Facebook globalization. There are different globalizations happening at the same time. There isn't just one globalization. And I wonder if that changes any of that. It's just become more complicated, whereas at one point it felt like it was a Western globalization, and that's what's changed. Does that make any sense?
The same, again, coming to Samuel Huntington, there is civilization and there is civilizations. So civilization is what sort of is different between, let's say, in the past, between us and the barbarians. They pretty much used to have their own civilization, but let's say it's us, the civilized people. But the globalization, it's what you're saying. It's intermingling. So whether we call it, it's many globalizations that are parallel, or it's just one with many brands, and it's just a matter of labeling. But eventually, it doesn't change a thing. It's there. And when you enumerated many of the globalizations, of the supposed globalization, you mentioned more than half of them were actually Western.
True. Let me come to Martin. Martin, I'm sure you've got thoughts on all those things, but I particularly want, because of what you said earlier, to comment on the energy issue. You mentioned earlier something I didn't know about this pipeline in Africa, and I'd like to get your thoughts on where there might be other sources of energy for Europe.
Definitely there might be other sources, and I would see that definitely in Africa as the opportunities I mentioned, as a mutual opportunity to strengthen our ties and to be mutually and equal partners who could benefit in the end from that. Not again be those like, okay, let's give us oil and gas, and we will later on maybe under some conditions borrow some money. Okay, let's make an equal trade and benefit from out of that, like both sides. And so I would, but it depends obviously on European leaders. It could happen simply that they will somehow, they will not see this as an opportunity, and they will go rather for the gas from the United States and somehow survive. Because I don't know, I would definitely see that. I would look south and give it a chance to build the mutual strengthen and refrain that whole mutual relation.
Pipeline. Mention that because those weren't in your session. But I didn't know about this. Pipeline.
There is that plan. Like Nigeria obviously has a lot of resources. Like already it's oil. Obviously they're here again. When I've been speaking about ecological issues in case of China mining. Well, honestly, we have to mention Shell doing the stuff in Niger Delta. Well, that's a huge ecological catastrophe actually still, there is an opportunity to somehow negotiate the resources like oil and gas and the other materials that European Union and European states will need from Africa, and it could serve.
So a pipeline from Nigeria through Algeria, possibly into Europe as an alternative gas pipeline. I got excited by that idea. Other questions from the audience? There's a guy here. Are there any other women that want to speak? I'm very keen to, as I say, to have female. So chap here, I'm sorry, nothing wrong with you speaking. And then we'll come to the lady there with it, if we can get the second mic to her, please. And then I can see you. Sorry? There's someone at the back? Okay, let me start with this guy because he's got a mic in his hand, so he's ready to go with a balloon and a mic. He's got this combination.
Hello.
Okay.
Thank you. I would like to ask you how possible it is for you that Ukraine will become for the world something like broken window in the street, like that symptom that everyone and suddenly start to make something bad around the world. Some countries will start demand something, bring up the other issues and want to solve it at once along with other problems. So are we doing enough for the Ukraine to not become the broken glass in the street?
Got it. Great. Thank you. Great question. Are we all going to... Is it going to just set such a terrible example? Well, if they do that, I can do that too. The young lady over here, is there another mic? Okay, I'd like to come to this lady next because I pointed to her, and then we'll come to you at the back. So let her cover first. Thank you.
Hi, sorry. I hope it's not too diverging from the main topic of the discussion, but I was intrigued what was said about the origin of the cultural capital of the West, like it being the power of individual creativity and stuff, which all sounds very nice, and I hope I'm not being too nihilistic, but I don't know, I like to contest that a little bit, because I would think it's, isn't it more about the historical imperialism of the US and the result of the Cold War and the propaganda campaign? Because if it was really about the power of democracy and stuff, I feel like perhaps in our cultures and cultures all around the world, there would be stuff more prominent from other countries other than the US and maybe the French and the British.
Get it. Yeah, I get it. So it's all coming from one way. We've got a story we're telling about democracy, but really it's still about power.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, it could come from all over the place.
Right.
Great. Thank you. Got that. And the guy at the back.
Yes. My question was, so how would Russia benefit from it becoming subservient to China? Because it seems like the main goal of it is sort of reignite the Soviet imperialism at that superpower status that Soviet Union once held. So what would be the benefit of Russia becoming basically sort of the heavily armed Chinese puppet?
Yeah, client of China. Brilliant. Yeah, we just talked about it. Okay, so let's start with the first question, which was the broken... I thought that was a really great question. Martin, let's just start with you this time, because you mentioned earlier in our previous discussion this very point, in a way, which is about borders in Africa. So I'd like you to make the point for this. I think it's the same point that... Well, you make the point about that, how this affects border disputes in Africa.
Well, it could heavily dispute, because obviously because we have been talking about some, let's call it New World Order. I don't know, it's fancy word for simply changing a situation. Because I was also thinking about that globalization change and change in the world. Come on, after the Cold War we have a unipolar moment. After the 9/11 we have, now something that, United States are not untouchable anymore. Then we have several other things. Now we are speaking what will be after Ukraine. It could influence. It's not a change of the order. I would agree with that. Maybe we only know now for sure that Russia is not strong. That's what I would say. That now finally we know for sure that Russia is weak. And that's something, because every time when I was being, for example, speaking with my students, I was like, okay, how would you say, what's the power situation around in the world right now? Is it unipolar, is it multipolar, or whatever, bipolar? And everyone was like, okay, like there is the United States, China, Russia, so it's okay, it's multipolar. So like, but look at the gap. Well, like if we take, if you even talk about some polarization, so let's say the coalitions of states, it could be together. So okay, let's say United States and all the allies. Then there is a China. Then there is a Russia, and the gap is enormous. And now we even see how enormous it is because Russia simply, it's definitely not so strong as it presented itself. Putin will need to show that he's winning. We've been discussing it yesterday, but what I mean with the border disputes, because there is some status quo, sovereignty is one of the cornerstones of the international system generally, and Russia very often somehow break this convention, and what it could means this change of the order could be that, well, the world according to Russia could be okay, states could do, it would be, well, realist, one of the schools of international relations would love it. You know, it's like we all live in anarchy, so because there is any authority above the states, so you can do whatever you want. You know, so we are homo homini lupus, simply the stronger eats one another, therefore the states want more and more power. And that would be probably what Russian world would definitely looks like. It's only about the stronger being able to go over the borders and take what they want. And I think that's the thing that now actually the world is fighting against. And this could be the issue for Africa, obviously, because the borders are disputed, even though all the African states somehow agreed that the borders are where they are. It could very easily happen.
So could you set the precedent, the borders? Let me just come to Matt, and particularly Matt, I'd also like you to comment on the question this young lady asked, because you were giving the big spiel about, this is what we believe, this is the best way in the world, but actually she's saying, isn't that just a story that the Americans have told to exert American power?
I think you have to, one question is, why does America have cultural power? If you compare to France and Britain, it's because there are 330 million Americans and there are only 65 million French people, and that's going to weigh. And there are, how many English speakers are there in the world? A billion or so, if you count the international market. Pop songs, that's the reason why Britain still produces half of the hit pop songs in the world, is because of the English language. I think there is a genuine dispute between different groups of people about where you see the source of Western cultural power, as you're saying, Western cultural capital. I don't believe that it lies in exploitation. I just don't think that I think lots of countries and civilizations exploit other people. I don't think the West has been particularly bad in terms of its exploitations of others. I think that the economic and social and political model that was developed in the West works better. And spreads wider, and people select it because it works better.
Yeah, but she's saying, why isn't it emerged elsewhere then? Why is it only coming from one direction? Surely, if it's so great, it should be popping up.
I don't even think that's true. I mean, I think it emerged in a bunch of different places simultaneously. The United States, had one revolution in the 1770s. France had a revolution in the 1780s. The French path towards democracy took 80, 90 years. I'm a big fan, actually, of Fukuyama, but of his later stages. And if you look at the way he looks at things, he feels the United States took a lot of steps early in it.
Fukuyama is.
Fukuyama wrote this amazing book that everybody knows about in the early 1990s called The End of History and the Last Man, which was kind of wrong. And he thinks it's wrong and explains it different ways. Subsequently, he's written these extraordinary histories of the development of governance everywhere in the world. We have, 5 minutes? So, one of the things that I think is extremely powerful in his analysis of what happens with democracies and government is the United States was incredibly corrupt in the 19th century because it was democracy. Democracy makes you corrupt. What you need not to be corrupt is to have an independent civil service. Germany has never been corrupt because Germany, Prussia, got an independent civil service, then became democratic. The United States was incredibly corrupt, had to get an independent civil service later, turn itself into a well-governed state after that. These innovations develop in different places, and I think it's inaccurate to say that everything is streaming out of the United States and that it's a one unidirectional model.
Fair point. Jacob, let me come to you. Let's start with the question at the end, which is the one we talked about earlier. Is there a danger that Russia becomes just a puppet of China, and is that a good or a bad thing for the rest of us?
Well, but the question is, whom are you asking that? God, if you believe in it, in her, if you will. I don't know, but there's no architect that is now in charge of things. There's no chessboard that is being played by a cabal of world leaders. So I don't know. No, I don't think it's a good idea. I hope it's not going to happen like that. I still hope that Russia will be in its power. It will be diminished because it is a danger not just to the West, but it's danger to all its neighbors. And that leads me back. And I'm sorry, we'll repeat what we had last discussion, to the appeasement and to the self-flagellation. Why do I need to think about what, your country and other West Europeans, not us, what you did in Africa, all around the world? You know, it's not, it is my problem. By what? Because I'm white European? I'm not guilty of colonization of any place. So I will not start a day with self-flagellation of what the English and the French and the Swedes did to people all around the world. Swedes, by the way, were were very big in selling slaves from Africa to America.
And the Spanish. Don't forget the Spanish. They were pretty bad.
Well, and the Swedes were they're good with their IKEA, but also with cages before IKEA, right? I'm Czech. I'm not guilty of that. Maybe by association. What is happening now is happening. It's a black and white conflict by Russia. Not by America, not by Western imperialism, whatever you want to call it. This is Eastern imperialism. Russia attacked a country because it wants to do, now, 3 dots, because I don't know. But anyway, they are doing a war of conquest. I can see that. Me, myself, in my 25 years of reporting from some of the world front lines, I covered 4 wars in which Russia was involved. Only one was not imperialist, because that was the war to sort of not let Chechnya go. But then the war for South Ossetia against Georgia, and by the way also for Abkhazia and Adjariat, but still remain out of Georgian control, in Syria, where there is no claim whatsoever, and now from 2014 in East Ukraine. What American imperialism should I talk about in this conflict? There is none. Thank God there are American values and interests that happen to be in line with this part of the world, because we know that the Baltic states, Czech Republic, Slovakia and Poland cannot win the war helping Ukraine against Russian imperialism. So let's leave the self-flagellation when we talk about Africa, when we talk about the past in South America, but not about this war. And to democracy and to the stuff that you didn't find laughable, but you said that they sound nice. In 1975, there was a big conference between East and the West, between NATO and Warsaw Pact in Helsinki, that had 2 main issues. Russia and us included. The Warsaw Pact actually did not want any American nuclear weapons in Europe because we were afraid they were aiming at us, which they were. And what the West wanted the East to start doing stuff like the rule of law, the freedom to express yourself, etc., etc. Why? Because they wanted that to destroy the system? Maybe. But are those things bad? No, because we are now living and every day, and that's, this is one of the, biggest expression. We can say whatever we want. So this eventually won over at least this part of the world. And just like what Matt said, we did not win, unfortunately, with this cultural example, maybe with the Coca-Cola can and with the Hollywood movies, not yet with the rule of law. But I completely agree with you. This is the only thing that is not only fine for an individual, but also the only way to be living in a prosperous society that does not need to wage a war of conquest if it wants to be respected more in the world.
Now, thank you. We're coming to an end soon. I'm sorry, there isn't time. There isn't. No, there isn't. This has been another brilliant discussion. I'm going to thank the guys in a minute for this, but I'm going to just mention our next session. So over the last few days here at Meltingpot, we've had, in this stage, we've had 4 big themes that have been discussed. We've obviously discussed today the world after Ukraine. On the first, yesterday they had a big series of discussions on climate change. Blimey, that's not a small issue, is it? Very, bigger than all of these issues. We've had a day of discussion about technology, and we've had a day looking into the digital future. If you didn't go to all of those, who went to every one of those days? You did. Wow, you went to every one. Well, fantastic. Some of you did. For the rest of us, you can get all 4 days in 1 hour in the next hour. It's a great package. It's a great deal. You get 4 for the price of 1, because we've got all 4 of the facilitators, me and the 3 other people that facilitated, having a panel where we're going to try and summarize some of the big things that came out of all 4 of those days. And I'll be amazed if there aren't some incredible crossovers for that. I'm going to ask, before I get you to clap these guys, I'm going to ask you one other thing, because we're going to do like all the bands do. You know the bands do at the end, they do a big selfie with all the crowd behind them going, yeah, we're going to do the same. So clap these guys, keep clapping, we're going to do a selfie. Come on guys, let's do a selfie.